So good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Ian Olasov to our At Home with Literati series and conversation this evening with Scott Hershovitz. Special thanks as well to the Department of Philosophy at the University of Michigan for sharing their involvement and for sharing this event with our community and their community as well. A quick overview of webinars. As you heard when you were joining, the chat is closed, but you might want to keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase Ask a Philosopher from Literati. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there's always links to purchase books in the description below. And you can submit questions. We did have a hotline up for a bit. We've got some questions through there, but if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature available to you at any time. It's on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll read off a few of those questions at the conclusion of the reading and conversation. And as a reminder, you can purchase more books at literatibookstore.com 24/7. We ship anywhere in the United States, and thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup if you live in the Southeast Michigan area. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our events, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you are joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and our moderator this evening. Ian Olasov is an adjunct professor and doctoral candidate at the City University of New York Graduate Center. His writing has appeared in Slate, Vox, Public Seminar, and elsewhere. He won the American Philosophical Association's Public Philosophy Op-Ed Prize in 2016 and 2018. He runs the Ask a Philosopher booth in locations around New York City and lives in Brooklyn. And Scott Hershovitz is the Thomas G. and Mabel Long Professor of Law and a professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan. He also directs the Law and Ethics program. Prior to joining the faculty at Michigan, he was an attorney advisor on the appellate staff of the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He also served as a law clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the U.S. Supreme Court and Honorable William A. Fletcher of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Please, they can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. Please join me in welcoming Ian Olasov and Scott Hershovitz into your living rooms.
Well, thank you, people that we can't see. We're super excited to have you with us tonight, and I'm especially excited to have Ian here because I think that this book is really phenomenal. I loved reading it, and I think it comes out of a super cool project. And I thought we should just start by hearing a little bit about that project from Ian. So tell us about the Ask a Philosopher booth.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. This should be fun. So I've run a public philosophy event series in the greater Brooklyn area called Brooklyn Public Philosophers for the last 7 years. We started off by running like a speaker series at the Brooklyn Public Library, and that was cool. It's cool to give people an opportunity to talk with philosophers, to meet philosophers, to find out what philosophers are up to, without reading like scholarly journals. But it was really the philosophers who were like driving the conversation, right? So it's like the subject matter of the evening was always determined by, whatever the philosopher's own preoccupations were. And I heard about something very similar to the Ask a Philosopher booth, which was a project put together by the philosopher Lawrence Blum with some of his actual like teenagers that he works with at the University of Boston or UMass Boston. And I was like, oh, I could do that. And so I did. So we got a bunch of, philosophy professors, and starting in the spring of 2016, right on time, we got a bunch of philosophy professors and grad students to, sit at a table at a farmer's market in Brooklyn. And we set out a little bowl of philosophical questions. And then later on, we added a bowl of thought experiments, little like imaginary scenarios that are supposed to somehow suggest interesting conclusions or philosophical problems, help you reason through philosophical problems in one way or another, and a bowl of candy, which was helpful. and we talked with people, and it was a hit. And then we did it, another few dozen times at subway stations and Pride Parade and in parks and in retail outlets and at street fairs and at a lot of farmers markets. And yeah, it was just we talked with a lot of people, and they had a lot of really interesting, surprising, evocative questions. And it was just like, and in addition to the questions, it was just like an opportunity to meet, I've got to bet, at least 1,000 people who I would otherwise never have spoken to. New York City is a big place. You don't talk to most of the people who live here when you live here, and so sort of all types came by the booth. So yeah, that's the story of the project in a nutshell.
So the question I most want to ask is, what were the best questions? But I think you've queued up some questions that made it into the book that maybe you want to share along with the answers.
Yeah, should we jump right into a reading?
Let's do it.
Can we do a reading? Okay, let's do a reading. Okay, here and now this is the first interactive component of the evening. Let's get to it. Here's if you'll bear with me. Can we try a choose your own adventure situation here? So I'm gonna give you a pair of possible chapters I could read, and if you like the first one, just type A into the Q&A, and if you like the second one, type B into the Q&A. Yes, use the Q&A to vote. So the first option is why is there anything instead of nothing? And the second option, if I can find it, is what is happiness? So yeah, if you want to do why is there anything instead of nothing, give me an A. And if you want what is happiness, give me a B. Let's see. B.
B
okay.
is the overall.
Okay. I'm getting a message. I'm noticing a pattern here. We got one A, one lone A. Okay. Let's do the happiness one. This was fun. Sometimes I had strong opinions about these questions before I wrote the chapter, and sometimes I formed my actual view in the process of writing the chapter. This was one of those. Okay. A little ground clearing. Different people mean different things by happiness, but I'll treat this as a question about subjective well-being, the aggregate of the psychological features of a person that perhaps partly constitute how well their life is going for them. Note that if how well your life is going is partly a matter of what's going on outside of your mind, say if you have the respect of your colleagues and friends, that's not happiness as I'm using the word. Note also that I take happiness to be whatever is going on in your mind that your well-being partly consists in or reduces to, not whatever is going on in your mind that causes or is correlated with your well-being. So it could be that listing the things that you're grateful for causes you to be happy, or that people who have a certain number of close friends are happy. But those things don't make for a happier life all on their own. Note, finally, that I'm thinking of a happy person as someone who has the psychological components of a life that's going well for them. Godzilla might be happy stomping through the streets of Tokyo, even if what makes him happy doesn't work out well for the locals. But that just makes the question a little more precise. It doesn't answer it. To get there, it's helpful to distinguish 4 theories. The hedonic theory says that happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. The preference theory says that happiness is getting what you want. The life satisfaction theory says that happiness is being satisfied with your life. And lastly, the emotional state theory says that happiness is a set of emotions and emotional dispositions. I don't have a strong view here, but I lean towards the hedonic theory. First, it seems like bedrock that if my life is more pleasant than yours, other things being equal, mine is going better for me. Second, it stands up pretty well to some compelling objections to the other theories. One problem with the preference theory, which says that happiness is a matter of getting what you want, what you prefer, is that people want all sorts of things that intuitively don't make their lives better. This could be because they're mistaken about the likely effects those things will have on them. I thought I would feel better if I drink a 5th cup of coffee for the day, but it turned out to be wrong. It could also be because our desires can be manipulated by features of our environments that intuitively have nothing to do with how well our lives are going for us. Keeping up with the Joneses, wanting the newest gadget when the current one is just fine, other so-called endogenous or adaptive preferences. And even if your preferences don't rest on any kind of mistake, some of them are, in a sense, entirely on behalf of other people. I'd like to see the literacy rate in Canada improve, but only because it would be good for the people of Canada. It wouldn't affect me much at all. These problems don't really apply to the hedonic theory. If I'm mistaken about the likely effects of some pleasant experience, I'm still better off, other things being equal, for having the pleasant experience. If I've been trained or manipulated, not just to want something, but to take pleasure in it, say by my early childhood exposure to spicy food, I'm still better off, other things being equal, for having that pleasure in my life. And I can pick out the preferences that have something to do with my well-being by looking for preferences it would be pleasurable to satisfy. There are a few problems with the life satisfaction theory too. One person could be more satisfied with their life than another, not because things are going better for them, but because they have really low expectations. If someone faces nothing but boredom, pain, and humiliation day after day, but they think this is what they deserve, or the most they could they could hope to get out of life, they might be very satisfied with their lives, but they won't be happy. It's also really hard to keep track of everything that happens to you. And so how satisfied you are with your life at any given moment could just be a matter of the first satisfying experience that comes to mind. Again, no problem for hedonism. Someone can't, as a rule, instantaneously make their life more or less pleasurable simply by changing their expectations. And to the extent that your expectations do affect how much pleasure and pain you experience, say if you set yourself up for disappointment by being overly confident you'll get some job you've applied for, something that's I'm sure never happened to me or any of you, it's not implausible that you could be happier than someone with an otherwise similar life just by expecting things to turn out differently. Again, being satisfied with your life requires you to make a really complicated, all things considered judgment about how things are going, which could be distorted in various ways. How much pleasure or pain you've experienced isn't, in this way, a matter of judgment. It's a matter of how your life is really going, independently of what you may think. Lastly, there's a lot to say for the emotional state theory. It doesn't make your happiness implausibly dependent on your expectations, on some tricky evaluation of your entire life, on your possibly misguided preferences, or on what you want for other people. And it's hard to doubt that a life with more positive emotions is going better than a life without, other things being equal. But the problem with the emotional state theory is that some things that make your life better aren't emotions. Stubbing your toe might make you angry, but the pain in your toe isn't an emotion. Having an orgasm might endear your partner to you, but the orgasm itself isn't that feeling of warmth or love or anything like that. Perhaps these things make less of a difference to your well-being than emotions, but they still make some difference. One sort of case that emotional state theorists use to argue for their view is a person who's deeply depressed, but manages for some period of time to distract themselves from their depression with a series of fun or engaging activities. They have a pleasurable life, but it seems weird to call them happy. I don't disagree, at least for some sense of happy, but I think we have a tendency to describe anything that's regrettable or inadvisable about someone's life as unhappiness. And there's clearly something regrettable about the distracted depressive. They're not as happy as they would be in the long run if they dealt with their depression more directly. And they're in an extremely fragile state. The slightest interruption in their series of distractions, and the depression is going to hit them like a ton of bricks. Their luck is going to run out eventually. Those things are all consistent with saying that, yes, for now, they have high subjective well-being. They're happy in the sense I'm interested in. The main problem for hedonism, at least that I'm aware of, is that there doesn't seem to be a single feeling of pleasure or pain. A peaceful walk in nature, the feeling of being well rested, a good workout, learning something interesting, eating a delicious meal, and hearing a funny joke are all pleasant experiences, but do they really have anything in common? I'm not sure how serious this problem is, though. It's certainly hard to describe at length what all pleasurable experiences have in common, but they do have one pretty clear thing in common, namely that they're all pleasurable experiences. I mean, maybe maybe pleasure and pain are extremely heterogeneous. Maybe different types of pleasure are incommensurable within certain limits. What's the going exchange rate between clever puns and solid naps? But so it goes, then different types of happiness are too. We might also object to hedonism on the basis that we really care about happiness, and pleasure seems small and insignificant by comparison. So happiness must be something more than pleasure. But this objection only seems plausible if you have small and insignificant pleasures in mind. It's pleasurable to fall deeply in love, to accomplish something meaningful with great difficulty, to have an intimate, life-changing conversation. To call these things pleasures isn't to sell them short. It's just to remind us that pleasures aren't all little things. So at the end of some of the chapters, I include little like vignettes about funny or affecting or sad or weird, mostly funny and affecting episodes that happened at the booth that have something to do with the question at hand. So there's one of these little sidebars here at the end of this chapter. So I'll read that too. I was talking with one visitor to the booth about the experience machine. It's this thought experiment. Suppose you could go in a machine that could give you the experience of anything you wanted. If you want to be a famous violinist, for example, it would give you the life of a famous violinist. These experiences wouldn't be real though, and you have to stay in the machine for the rest of your life. Setting aside your responsibilities in the real world, taking care of people and paying your taxes or whatever, would you go in the machine? And if not, does that mean that there's more to well-being than happiness? The person I was talking with had a great argument for no. The way we find out what makes us happy is by getting thrown, this person told me and taught me, is by getting thrown into new situations, trying new things, and seeing how we like them. We have to discover what we like. When you go into the experience machine, you only bring the likes that you've already discovered. If the experience machine only gives you these things, wouldn't you risk out on all the joys you haven't learned of yet? I love that. I love that little conversation that I had with that guy. That was fun. Okay, good. I've got a couple of more options for a couple of more chapters. These ones will be a little bit shorter. Maybe I'll just do. That was a long chapter. That was a lot of words. So maybe I'll just do one more chapter. Okay, I'll skip to some of these. So here are two options. Option A, just smash that A in the Q&A window. Is ketchup a smoothie? And option B is, what's your favorite animal? So give me an A if you'd prefer, is ketchup a smoothie? And give me a B if you'd like, what's your favorite animal? Okay. I'm gonna open up this Q&A. A, B, B. A. Ooh, okay. A. A's.
Yeah.
A's. Oh.
I want to hear A too, because as I mentioned, Ian, before this started, it's been a topic of conversation among my kids. We discovered the question through the book, and we've been discussing it all week. So let's hear the answer.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I see. Peter Railton said B in the chat. I literally skipped over a footnote discussing Peter Railton's work in the is happiness in the what is happiness chapter. Now I feel bad that I didn't read it. Okay. Okay. So. Let's do is ketchup a smoothie then, because it's roughly a tie, and Scott's the vice president of this. Is that how this works? Okay. Is ketchup a smoothie? Part of what I love about this question is that it does what a lot of great philosophy does. It takes a familiar, otherwise unremarkable feature of everyday life, in this case the smoothie, and makes it seem unfamiliar or puzzling. It's really hard to say what we mean by smoothie in a way that excludes ketchup, but includes all of the uncontroversial examples of smoothies. But of course, if no one had ever put the question to you, you would never have included a ketchup on a list of smoothies. I think the answer lies in the subtle pressures that shape how we use a word from one context to the next. Think of the word weight with a G. Your physics textbook tells you that weight means impressed gravitational force. But even though astronauts in orbit around Earth are under considerable impressed gravitational force, we still call them weightless, roughly because if you put one on a normal scale, it wouldn't budge. So in contexts where the textbook definition is in charge, we'll use weight to mean impressed gravitational force. But in contexts where it's important that we're using normal scales to measure weight, we'll use weight to mean whatever normal scales measure. The ketchup question gets us to look for a single definition that will include all the smoothies and exclude all the non-smoothies. This desire for a definition will push us to use the word with an unusually uniform meaning. Not what we mean when we put it on diner menus, for example, not what we mean when we put it on diner menus, for example, where our goal is to communicate reasonably clear expectations about what you will get when you order something. So the answer is maybe ketchup is a smoothie now, but it wouldn't have been if you hadn't asked the question. Either way, if you drink it through a straw, please seek medical attention. And there's another one of these little vignettes, so I'll share this. A woman came up to us with her daughter who looked to be about 9. This is where this question came from. The mom asked the daughter, do you have a question? The daughter thought for a second, then gave us the smoothie question. Before we could say anything, the mom objected. No, that's not a philosophical question, but that's exactly what it is. that is really what happened to this conversation. That mom was like, "You have a philosophical question?" "Oh, yeah, is ketchup a smoothie?" And the mom was like, "No, like a good question, like a real question." But all of the philosophers were like jumping up and down, like waving their hands, like, "No, with the smoothie one. We like the smoothie one. Like, let's talk about the smoothie one." There you go.
So yeah, I found what you said at the end suggestive and interesting, but I wasn't yet sure I grasped it. You said the ketchup might be a smoothie because the question was asked, but it wouldn't have been beforehand. What do you mean?
So I think, this chapter was written a little telegraphically. So to spell it out a bit more detail. So there are these subtle pressures, which I allude to, that change what we use a word like smoothie to pick out in the world subtly from one context to another. So, in the weight example, it's the pressures are sort of whether it's like the textbook definition. So like, which is necessary for cranking out theorems in your high school physics class about the weights of various objects. And in other cases, the relevant pressure is like, well, you got to put somebody on a scale and then read what the scale says, and that tells you how much the person weighs. And it could be different sorts of scales, spring scale, whatever. My thought is that this question itself is one of those sorts of pressures for the word smoothie. So that asking this question is effectively asking for a definition. And asking for a definition does this weird thing of sort of imposing this sort of flatness or semantic uniformity or something on the words we use. It presses us to look for a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a smoothie or something like that. And when you are when you're under those sorts of pressures, all of a sudden you're going to use smoothies to refer to different sorts of things. Some things that you previously might have called soups, some things that you previously might have called condiments. If you come to a definition, say that a smoothie is an in principle drinkable blend of fruits and vegetables, maybe with a little bit of milk or water or ice cream added to it, then that's going to include ketchup.
Yeah, so our conversation here fixed on two possible qualities that might have made the difference. My wife was really fixed on the lack of a base in ketchup. And then we were also interested in the fact that the tomatoes were cooked. We thought that those might be features that distinguish them from more core cases of smoothie. But I do think there's a kind of really interesting, more general philosophical point in what you're saying. So the thought I take it, like with the weight example, is that some words, their meaning shifts with the context. And sometimes it's very easy to see. So if you ask somebody, is the refrigerator empty, right? In some contexts, the answer to that question could be yes, even though it has things in it, right? It might have just, ketchup and mustard and relish, but there's nothing with which we could make dinner. So that's an empty fridge. We need to order takeout. But if we're packing up the fridge to move, is the refrigerator empty? If it's only gonna be empty if there's nothing in it that could rattle around or explode as it's getting carried out of the building. And so your thought is that even words like smoothie might be context sensitive in that way.
Yeah. So I think one of the ways that philosophers are familiar with words sort of changing how they work from one context to another has to do with vague words. So so empty is a complicated example, but I think you can at least understand it on this model of vagueness. So there's a continuum between something being some kind of complete, never seen in nature vacuum. Okay, that's the paradigm case of emptiness, and something being somehow a plenum, full. There's nothing else you could possibly add to that space. Empty is this vague word which sort of picks out things that are sort of on one end of that spectrum, but exactly what region of the spectrum sort of shifts from one moment to the next. People often make this case with bald. So when my brother started to like lose just a little bit of his hair, it's, oh my God, like I'm bald, you know, when he was 30 years old or whatever. It's like, okay. But if you were making a biopic about Yul Brynner and you needed to cast somebody to look like him and some guy had like a handful of hairs on his head, you say, oh no, I need somebody who's bald. I need somebody who's really bald. This guy's not gonna fit the bill. So like, this is one way that words can, one relatively familiar way that words can sort of change how they work from one context to another. But I think there's a much wider range of cases that I think we often subsume under the idea of words changing their meaning over time, like the way that ambitious changed its meaning over time in English from meaning like ambitious in a bad way to meaning something like ambitious the way that we use it now. But I think these things that we often think of as semantic drift over time actually happen in the space of short conversations for like temporary stretches. There's a really excellent book, which I've got behind me somewhere, by the philosopher Mark Wilson, called Wandering Significance. If people want to check that out, this is where I really got the answer to the smoothie question and the weight example in particular. So he discusses the word robin, like the name of the type of bird, where when European colonists first came to the United States, they had a word for European robins, and then they saw something that kind of looked similar, and they used it to just refer to robins in the US, but they're completely unrelated birds that kind of sort of look similar. And I don't think anybody at the time would have said, ah, yes, now robin has ceased to mean what it used to mean, and it means something different now. It's just sort of like what robin means for those people at that time was a sort of like, well, this is the word they had on hand. They needed something to distinguish this bird from the, you know, the ducks and the swans and whatever. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Sure. So I'm filled with more questions, but also the Q&A is open, and I think Ian is happy to treat this like an Ask a Philosopher booth. So any questions that you want to ask a philosopher, you've got you know, at least one on hand. But there was another question in the book that I've just, because of something I've been writing, I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think it's kind of a deceptively interesting question. I think somebody who's trained in philosophy immediately sees what's engaging about it, but others might not. So I just wanted to invite you to talk about whether jelly beans taste the same to people who like them and people who don't.
Yeah, this is a hard one, and I may or may not have changed my mind since I wrote the book chapter, but so some people find jelly beans disgusting, or find most jelly beans disgusting. I'm one of them. I guess I like some sour jelly beans, but I find most of them gross. Other people think jelly beans are really tasty. There's an interesting question you can raise about taste, which is like whether they taste the same to these two people. Does the mere fact that something tastes bad to someone and to one person and tastes good to another person mean that it tastes different to those two people? The discussion in the book goes into a lot of possible arguments you could use to reason about this question. I think the one argument that is sort of most compelling to me is that an individual person can go from liking jelly beans to not liking jelly beans in a very short period of time, right? Like if you just eat too many jelly beans, then you'll go from enjoying the way they taste to not enjoying the way they taste. If you've had, you know, after your third pound of jelly beans for the day or whatever it is. I don't think that these people will necessarily say that the jelly beans have changed their taste in the course of that. So that seems to that seems like a pretty convincing argument to me that that jelly beans can, that how something, whether somebody enjoys the way something tastes doesn't necessarily have to sort of constitute the way it tastes to them, that you can enjoy or not enjoy something and it can still taste the same. Yeah, I think that's the main argument I think that convinces me here. One of the there are so many complications here. One of the big ones, which I tried to sort of dodge in the book, is that taste is a weird sensory modality because it's sort of like conventional wisdom thinks like you've got your 5 senses and then, you know, taste is one of them and smell is another, but like not really, right? So if you hold your nose and eat anything, it can have it tastes different. It has a much narrower flavor profile. And so, you know, a lot of what we think of as the tastes of things are, in some sense, the smells of things, or maybe our sort of everyday conventional wisdom, folk categories, whatever you want to call them, of how we sort of chop up our experiences into different sensory modalities. Like, not quite. You know, there are some psychologists who are very happy to say that we have, you know, tons and tons of senses. We have not just you know, different, maybe we have 2 senses of smell, for example, because there's one way that your brain processes smells when you're breathing in, and another way that your brain processes odorants when you're breathing out. Does that mean you have 2 different senses of smell? You know, you have a bunch of bones in your ear, which are sort of like a little gyroscope, which keep track of your body's orientation in space. So a lot of psychologists think we have a sense of proprioception, or a sense of our body's orientation in space. But like, I don't know, unless it doesn't feel like I have that sense most of the time. It doesn't, I mean, I only notice that when I have like vertigo or I stumble or something like that. So in any case, our sensory experiences might be much weirder and much richer than we typically take them to be.
Yeah. So again, just invitation if people want to jump in. I want to push on the jelly bean question a little bit. So what your argument seems to show is that it's that we can distinguish the enjoyment from the taste. So it could continue to have the same taste, and my enjoyment of it could shift if I've had a lot of it recently, or if I somehow came to associate it with some bad experience. But it still seems to leave open, in a way, right? Whether different individuals taste the same thing and then just have different attitudes towards the taste that they share in common, or the experience that they're sharing in common, or whether it's possible that there are different jelly bean eating experiences that different jelly bean eaters have. And I'm wondering if you think you have if there's any way we could get insight into that question, or is it entirely mysterious to us?
I mean, I think there is, if you scratch the surface, or maybe do more than scratch it, maybe you have to go a few feet below the surface. There is a deep and unsolvable mystery here, I suspect. But I think you can make a little bit of progress by sort of cleaning up the question around the edges and sort of considering the various reasons, sort of pro and con, thinking that the jelly beans taste the same. So one piece of sort of like, you know, tidying up with that we can do, which I think is helpful, is it's one thing to say that, you know, well, of course, the person who enjoys the jelly bean has a different experience in some way than the person who doesn't enjoy the jelly bean. And then it's just a terminological question. It's a question about words, whether we call that difference in experience a difference of how things taste to them. Well, do we include the, you know, what do you want to call it, hedonic value, you know, how much the enjoyment that people get out of taste as part of the tastes, or do we not? So, you know, I think there are some sort of merely verbal or terminological questions which are in this vicinity, but there's also a substantive one. And the substantive one is, does the, setting aside the enjoyment itself, yes, these two people's experiences differ with respect to enjoyment. Do they necessarily have to differ in some other way? Do they have to, in order for one person to enjoy it and the other person not to? That's the question. That's the substantive question. And I think the first person kind of answer, which is like, yes, like if you eat enough jelly beans in a row, they can, different things can happen in your mouth. If you have too much sugar in your mouth at a time, you can sort of dry out, and it can be this sort of unpleasant, tacky kind of feeling. And you don't get that at the beginning, but you do get it at the end. But even setting that sort of aside, like imagine that you're drinking plenty of water through the whole experience or whatever. It does seem to me like there's some, the whole range of taste experiences that you're having, it remains the same, other than this change in enjoyment. That seems to be like the sole dimension, at least in some cases, if you're appropriately hydrated or whatever. For me, like first personally, I don't eat a lot of jelly beans, but I get this from, I eat a lot of Skittles. I eat a lot of candy for an adult. So, I'll always, by the end of a bag of Skittles, I'm like sort of over it, but like, I don't want to have 3 Skittles left in a bag to, sit around and, eat them tomorrow or something. So I'll finish the bag of Skittles, but like, I don't like it as much by the end. But, the Skittles certainly the physical properties of the Skittles don't change. My body doesn't change, at least in any sort of long-term or enduring way. I go through all sorts of fluctuations. I might, what do behaviorist psychologists call it when some stimulus becomes is it extinguished, when some conditioned response to a stimulus goes away because you've experienced the stimulus too much. So there might be things might be extinguished in some way. But that seems to be from my own experience a sort of apt description of what happens. But there's also a possibility that different people have different experiences. Your mileage may vary. Let's see. Questions in the chat.
Yeah, you do have questions now as well. I was about to ask a follow-up about qualia and insoluble problems, but I think now the Q&A is filled up, so I'll go for it.
Okay, let's see. So Shannon asks, why don't people believe or trust science? Thinking about the rising number of coronavirus cases and the people who somehow still believe it's a hoax or that masks do nothing to help. Yeah, I mean, I've got a take on this. Scott, do you have a preferred answer to this question?
No, I want to hear your take.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that happens when people sort of become skeptical or maybe skeptical isn't the right word, maybe skeptical is kind of honorific, but when people stop believing what scientists tell them in some domain or stop taking it seriously, I think one of the things that happens is that people realize that they are dependent on these networks of kind of testimony of people telling each other stuff for what they know about the world. And in very few cases when you learn something on the basis of what other people tell you, in relatively few cases do you go up and follow it up for yourself. I read things in the newspaper every day, which I don't confirm personally in my own. I understand there's a military conflict in Azerbaijan. I've never been to Azerbaijan. I probably won't be anytime soon. I haven't seen the pictures of it or any video footage of it or anything like that. So people learn that they're sort of dependent on others for their knowledge through testimony. And sort of if you want to be critical of some piece of testimony that you've acquired, you don't have too much to sort of support your credence in them. You just sort of have to trust them. So people ask, why should I believe what this scientist tells me? They're just telling me stuff, and I've never seen these experiments conducted for myself, and so on. I think people are tapping into this kind of groundless, in some sense, dependence that we have on other people. But I think that's a sort of maybe excessively charitable way of putting it. I think often what happens is just like people's beliefs are determined to a great extent by the groups that they identify with. And, it's not a matter of, reasoning for yourself, or if it is, reasoning for yourself is a matter of justifying post hoc the things that your group has already told you to believe. And I think that's largely the case with the coronavirus. I mean, with the coronavirus, there might be this sort of extra, nudge in the direction of disbelief, right? Which is that the world would be a lot better if the coronavirus weren't real. It would be convenient if I could just sort of go out of the house and do everything that I'd ordinarily done and go visit my friends, all of the stuff, all of the activities that I miss, if I'd like to do them again. I'd like to live in a world where those things are safe. So, you have a kind of practical reason to delude yourself here. I think that's a big part of it anyway. Do you want to take a stab at it, or?
Do you want to pick up the next question in the chat?
Sure. Sure. Peter asks, sorry, I missed the beginning. So you might have already addressed this, but did many of the people who approached you assume that a philosophical question would have an answer that you could supply, or that philosophical questions typically don't have answers, so are less like requests for information than invitations to discussion and exploration, or to the expression of commitments and values, or some other conception of the nature of a philosophical question? Yeah, I think a lot of, people, their sort of basic understanding of what a philosophical question is like, in some sense, it's like a question you can't answer definitively. I think that's what how a lot of people understand sort of what makes a question philosophical. Certainly people didn't, whether people sort of defer to us as like experts whose opinions they should take very, very seriously, or somehow treat like expert testimony in some other domain, like if they were talking to a historian or a physicist or something like that. That actually varied from person to person. So, as people would especially, I think, but maybe people were more likely to regard us as experts whose testimony they should defer to if they were asking kind of like scholarly questions, like what did Plato think? What Hegel thought have to do with a question which I'm not in a position to answer, but what Hegel thought have to do with some current event issue that was taking place at the time that the booth was held. So people were in some cases likely to defer to us in that way. But I mean, the point of the booth and the point of the book to a great extent is not just for us to tell people what the true answers are to various philosophical questions, right? The point of the book and the point of the booth is to get people thinking for themselves, to get people to see that philosophy is like a normal activity, a valuable one, something that you can get something out of, something that can sort of make contact in useful, productive ways with their everyday concerns, with things that the questions that they have on their minds walking around the street.
So I'm looking at the participant list and seeing that there are lots of philosophers. And so I want to ask a question on behalf of us as a group, although I think it's a question that will be, the answer may be useful even to people who aren't philosophers. So I'm just stunned by the bravery of the booth, right, from the philosopher's perspective, because people could come up with anything, right? They could come up with questions that you would recognize as philosophical that would be, on any topic whatsoever, not the topics that you specialize in your work. They could also come up with questions that sound to them as philosophical, given their conception of what philosophy is, but not questions that you would recognize as falling within a philosopher's expertise. So I want to hear a little bit about what makes you comfortable doing this? What puts you in the right frame of mind? How do you handle the questions that strike you as either off the wall or totally excellent philosophical questions, but just not at all something you've thought about, prepared for, or ready to engage?
Yeah. Yeah, both of those things happen. So, people would ask, sometimes people would ask sort of stump the philosopher type questions about, when Kant says this in the Second Critique or whatever, and it's okay. I haven't read the Second Critique. I don't know what Kant says. And so then we can sort of change the subject to something nearby that we can have a profitable discussion of, or the person can feel like they've stumped the philosopher and they can go enjoy the rest of their day, or not enjoy it, I guess. So sometimes people will ask questions that are, they're not trying to stump us. They have real authentic concerns, which we're just not in a position to answer. So sometimes people would ask questions about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. I'm not a philosopher of physics. I don't know basically anything about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. But then I think we can say, hey, I don't really know. Here are a couple of things I've heard. What gets you interested in this? Why do you care about this? And then what makes one interpretation appealing to you or not appealing to you, and then we can have a discussion from there, not intending to sort of get to the bottom of the matter. Although I do think it helps to be, sometimes professional philosophers, I think, are trained in grad school to be to keep their mouths shut unless they've read all of the literature on some topic. At least in a lot of contexts, or at least in sort of, scholarly contexts. People don't do this when they're teaching intro classes, where you have to have something to say about, anything that could come up in an intro class, which is to say, anything at all. But I do think it helps to not have that, to not have that sort of sense that you are only kind of entitled to, or say something if you've exhaustively read all the literature, or that it's irresponsible for you to say something. Maybe I'll say one philosophical reason why people might have for this kind of practice is they might think of talking about philosophical questions that they're not experts in public as what people sometimes call expert trespassing testimony. So the way that sometimes engineers will who don't believe in anthropogenic climate change will get on TV and say, hey, I'm a scientist. I have my PhD, and I don't believe climate change is real. And people rightly complain, yeah, well, you're a scientist, but you're the wrong kind of scientist. You're whatever. You have the wrong sort of expertise. It doesn't count. People shouldn't take what you say seriously about climate change. They should take what you say seriously in some other domains. But philosophical, and this gets back to Peter's question before, but philosophers' testimony isn't generally taken up in the same way as that a testimony of physicists and sociologists, or pick your favorite science, whatever. And so you don't run the risk of in at least in the vast majority of cases, you don't run the risk of really deluding people into thinking, oh wow, this person must have the correct answer to the mind-body problem. So so they've said so. So so I gotta believe it. So the problem of expert trespassing testimony, it either doesn't exist at all for philosophers, or doesn't exist in as acute a form as it does for other sorts of experts. So if there is such a thing as philosophical expertise at all. There's something philosophically interesting to be said about what can make people reluctant to talk about these things. And when people, or to talk about sort of any philosophical topic that might come up. And when people ask questions that are like not questions that I regard as philosophical questions, usually you can just change the subject, and there's an interesting and fun sort of skill. Again, I think people probably acquire this to some extent doing, teaching intro. There's a really fun skill which you get to sort of hone and exercise in the course of doing the booth, which is the skill of making the connection, finding the angle. Okay, so somebody's asked me some question about dream interpretation or astral projection or whatever, and it's like, okay, well, I don't regard that as philosophy. But we can ask questions about, if somebody wants to talk about dream interpretation, we can talk about meaning. We can talk about what so what could possibly determine whether some dream means something at all? Dreams aren't words or and things that we use to communicate. So how could a dream mean anything? Or for that matter, we could talk about the role of storytelling in people's lives. Why is it important to you that you have a story to tell about your dream? What does that matter to you? Why does it matter to you that these things in your life take some kind of narrative form? That's an interesting question, and that I do regard that as a philosophical question. So there's always not always, it can be hard, but there's very often when people ask questions that I don't regard as philosophical questions. It's if you've got an open mind and you're not dismissive of the person, if you're sort of on this, if you treat it as a sort of shared inquiry with another person, you can find the angle, you can make the connection to philosophy often relatively seamlessly. Yeah,
I mean, two of the things I really loved about the book were your comfort saying that you didn't know the answer, and then also the ways in which you would take very open-ended questions, what's the meaning of life, and channel them in a direction where you might be able to make some progress. So for those who haven't read the book, it's really impressive to watch Ian reinterpret questions in ways that then become the kinds of questions that you might answer and where the answer might be illuminating, even if things didn't seem to start that way. Do people teach you things at these booths?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean that little vignette with the in the discussion of the experience machine was one of those sorts of examples where somebody had a novel point to make about the experience machine. There's another vignette in the book. We were talking about the ring of Gyges, this invisibility ring, and whether if you had an invisibility ring, it would turn you into an awful person. And this is I think a really good thought experiment. It's a good question to ask. But somebody pointed out that well, if you want to ask whether people behave differently when they're invisible, well, people are in fact invisible to other people all the time in their daily lives. So you could be in a room with no other people, or you could be in a room with blind people or people with vision impairments. I've only spent so much time with people who were functionally blind in my life, but when I didn't act like people sometimes hypothesize you would act with the ring of Gyges. I didn't just become a complete asshole, like as soon as I thought somebody could wouldn't see what I was doing. So I thought that was just really, really apt. This thought experiment is fun, but it doesn't have to be a thought experiment. Look for the real world analog of what the thought experiment asks you to imagine. And you don't have to just use your imagination. You can go out and turn this otherwise purely conceptual question or purely imaginative question into an empirical one, and then you can make some headway. I think that's often how we make headway in philosophy.
So I think I see there are two more questions that they're waiting in the queue. If you want to take those up.
Sure. Yeah. We had one from Shannon before, so I'll turn to this one from Vinny. Hey, Vinny. Hey, everyone. Thanks for doing this. Apologies if this was already covered. Did the kinds of conversations you had with children who approached the booth alter or inspire certain views about when to introduce philosophy in K-8 education? How so? I think I had probably already been on board with the idea that people should study philosophy way before they go to college. But one of the reasons why there are a lot of reasons why I think why people are reluctant to take this idea seriously. One reason why they're reluctant to take it seriously is that they think that children just can't do philosophy, that philosophy is something that's sort of only done with any kind of seriousness or skill by dead geniuses or something like that. I think often people regard philosophy not just as a practice that children can't do, but that practice that's unavailable to most living adults, or perhaps all living adults. And this is just materially false. You just go out and you see what kids have to say, and they have interesting things to say. I think they have, at the very least, they have interesting questions. Although questions themselves can sort of come with presuppositions or reflect reasoning that's already been taken place. I'll just give one example. One of the best questions we got at the booth, we had, and just one of my personal favorite encounters. There was a mom and a daughter. The kid looked like she was maybe 9 years old. The kid was just sort of like overflowing with energy. And the mom was having this conversation with us about growing up on a farm and the animal minds and the political questions that come out of your encounters with animal minds. It was really interesting. And this kid was sort of flitting around and picking things up and putting stuff down and flying around. And then eventually it was like, okay, well, do you have any questions? And this kid all of a sudden was like, if we colonized Mars, who should own the land? How would you set a price for the land? If people have different ways of valuing the land or make different claims on the land, how do you settle these claims? What would you use the land to do? What's the appropriate way to use the land? And it was like, while I'm just sort of, just my jaw hit the ground. The kid just like sped away. She was like, didn't have time for the answer. But like, so that's not the kid didn't give us an answer to the question, but the question itself is really suggestive, and the question itself is, suggests various lines of reasoning that the kid had probably already undertaken at some level on her own. So yeah, so if your reason for thinking that people shouldn't do philosophy when they're 9 years old at the least is that they're incapable of it, well, that's just false. Look at this kid.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Ian knows I'm writing a book about my kids and philosophy, so I'm a passionate believer in the thought not just the kids can do philosophy, but they inevitably do philosophy. As they try to make sense of the world, philosophical questions occur to them, and they try to answer them, and you can get a lot out of engaging them about it. And then also, if you have kids in your life and you want to engage them in philosophical questions, there's a really wonderful website called Teaching Children Philosophy that is has a list of picture books, which are among the most popular picture books. So there'll be picture books that you might already have around, or that the kid might already have around. And then it provides an explanation of what kinds of philosophical issues are raised by that story, and a list of discussion questions that you can talk to the kids about. So I'm fully on board with Ian's thought that little kids are philosophers. Do you want to take a shot at the last question here, Ian?
Sure. Let's see. So, why do dogs love us back? Oh my God, I love it. I guess. So there's a way of treating this question as like a purely psychological question. So what has to happen to a dog in order for them to love a person? We could go out and conduct some experiments. I'm not sure how to do that, but that's above my pay grade, I guess. But I think there's a recognizably philosophical question for me in the vicinity, a question that I think we could make some headway on without doing the experimental work, which is like, does it make sense for dogs to love us? So, we can ask, what causes dogs to love us, but we can also ask whether love is a sort of fitting or appropriate or reasonable attitude for dogs to take towards us. So there's and this is a philosophical question because it's not clear at all what it means for an attitude to be fitting or appropriate or reasonable. This is really hard. So I've got my favorite theory of what it takes for an emotion or something like love, which isn't an emotion but is some sort of like complex of emotional dispositions. I think what it takes for an emotion or set of emotional dispositions to be reasonable. I think has to do with the functions of those emotions, which is roughly like, what do these emotions do for us that explains why we keep them around? So in the case of the sort of love that dogs have for people, I guess what explains which we could try to, it takes a bit of work to describe what that love might be, but I guess what the function of that emotion is that it helps us care for them and keep them in our lives. Dogs are dependent on us, at least, well, not all dogs, but our pet dogs are. I have 2 dogs. They're both, I know very well. They're very, very dependent on me. I don't know how long they'd make it in the streets of Brooklyn without me and my partner caring for them. Their love for us is part of what keeps them around. So it sounds callous to say this, but like, if my dogs were my dogs are very sweet. Sometimes they're difficult, but they're very, very sweet. If they were completely awful, if they just did nothing but bite and scratch and show no gratitude or anything like that, I'm not such a magnanimous person that I would keep 2 dogs around in my 1-bedroom apartment. I only keep them around because they're so loving. And so yeah.
Can I ask a question just in relation to the last bit of the answer that you gave? This is another philosophical question lurking here, which is, can you understand the dog's emotion given the conditions of the dog's life as a kind of love, right? So, you describe the dog, I think rightly so, as dependent on you and required to show you certain sorts of, here we have a dog.
Okay.
Required to show certain sorts of attitudes in order for you to continue caring. And I wonder if you think that in those conditions, it's proper to construe what you're receiving as love, or is it a different kind of performance?
Yeah, well, sometimes people, oh, here's the other dog who's making an appearance. There we go. Okay, this is Gus and that's Scrapple. Thank you, Jen. Is the thought that if it's got strings attached, if it's conditional in some way, then it's not really love?
No, that there's a kind of, at least for a certain kind of love, there's a kind of lacking of the autonomy that would come from having a choice of living differently. And maybe that's not a condition of all kinds of love, but it's arguably a condition of some kinds of love, right? That the dog's life may not satisfy.
Yeah, that's right. Good. So I think there's a terminological question here and there's a substantive one. So the terminological question is like, well, given, this extremely goofy set of behaviors that Gus is demonstrating right now, is this an attitude that I would call love? And it's like, yeah, it is. Although, if you didn't want to call it love, you wouldn't have to. You're allowed to use the word however you want. But the substantive question is, well, in what respects is this relationship like the other sorts of loving relationships that we can talk about? And I have absolutely no idea. I have, think about the enormous range of objects and creatures that people can love. So people can, at least nominally, or that people can say they love. So people can love activities. People can love not people, but features of people. Oh, I love how smart that person is, or something like that. People can love their friends and their family members and celebrities. People can love God. People can love, saints and martyrs and so on, people that they've never met, but that have some kind of spiritual connection to. Even if you're sticking to romantic love, there's, those romantic relationships change over time. That's, the way a relationship works at the beginning is very different than the way it works 50 years in. So, in what ways is there anything at all that all of those types of relationships have in common? I don't know. In particular, is there anything that the dog type of love has in common with, for example, my love for my friends or my love for my romantic partner? Well, yeah, it has some. There are some similarities. So, my dogs at least look, if I'm reading them right, they look disappointed when I get angry at them. They take my scolding them more seriously than they take strangers scolding them, and that's something that happens when you love a friend or love someone romantically. They don't like it when they have, because of the pandemic, they have through the roof separation anxiety. So they really don't like it when we leave. And that's, my partner and my friends don't have anything like that separation anxiety to that extent, but they have a version of it. If I thought that I would never see a close friend again, I would feel really bad about that. So, there are some things that they have in common with these sorts of loves, but there are other ways in which they're different, right? There's in particular the sort of autonomy that you're talking about is lacking for, Gus has some kinds of autonomy, but I didn't feel too bad about just picking him up like a baby and doing whatever I wanted with him, and I don't think he feels too bad about it either, in part because of his lack of autonomy. So yeah, I don't have the reason why I feel like I'm not in a position to answer this question completely is because I feel like I'd need a richer understanding of what his relationship is to me and my relationship is to my friends and my relationship is to my romantic partner before I can say what all of these relationships have in common and how they disagree. I'll just give a plug for my single favorite paper about love written by a philosopher that people can go check out and that I just taught like 2 weeks ago. It's by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum and it's called Love's Knowledge. And it's about not so much about what love is or what counts as love, but about how you know when you're in love or when you're deceiving yourself as to whether you're in love with someone. And it's a masterpiece. It's just an excellent paper. So people might get some mileage out of that.
Terrific. So I don't know how much time we have left. John, are we where we should wrap up, or should we take more questions, or?
I think we're at the end of our question list. We normally wrap up with the hour. Of course, I'd be willing to go another hour. I have so many questions of my own, but I think we should wrap up. I guess there is maybe one question that I could ask to close, that I think maybe touches on some of the stuff that has already been discussed, perhaps, but. I'm interested to hear both of your thoughts on this, and related to our first question about the pandemic, and related to the Ask a Philosopher booth, and related to the question about insoluble problems, which is that we definitely live right now in this sort of strange moment where there seems to be these kinds of like encampments of credulity to our first question, whether that's to what kind of testimonies we are receptive to, etc. And people sometimes call this a post-truth moment, which normally I don't like those buzzwords, but I've been thinking about that a lot as being quite apt, even though it doesn't come sort of like in the sense of like postmodernism or something like that kind of philosophical tradition's relationship to truth. I think they would be beguiled by what constitutes post-truth right now. And so there's like a lot of this weirdness, and maybe it's always been there, but it seems at a fever pitch these days. And I'm wondering, for both of you who are philosophers who specialize and who teach philosophy and who are in nose to the grindstone in philosophy, but also who have a relationship with the quote unquote lay public. Scott, you just had a really wonderful opinion piece about forgiveness and Taylor Swift. And Ian, you have this wonderful book out. What is it still that philosophy can provide to that public, even in this time where, yes, there are these encampments of credulity, and there is this resistance to expertise, and there is this fear of narrative that's happening. What is it that philosophy still offers the general public, and why is it important to have public-facing philosophers? I'm sorry, that's a really long question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think there are a lot of different things there are a lot of different reasons why we keep philosophers around. One, which I think is especially, apt or relevant in this context, isn't so much to do with sort of what specific content you learn from philosophy, what you learn about various philosophical problems or theories, or what this philosopher thought or that philosopher thought or something like that, but what you learn about how to talk with other people, so that what you're talking about is some sort of breakdown in our epistemic networks and the networks that we use to share knowledge with one another. And what you're talking about a lot of things. That's one of the things you're talking about. And one of the things that you can do to help repair broken epistemic networks or broken epistemic connections between people is to put them in a situation where they are, for whatever reason, encouraged to take each other seriously, encouraged to treat each other respectfully. And I think that, when it's working at its best, this is what philosophy does for people. One thing that I've noticed at the speaker series that I organize is that often people are talking about problems, which could very easily be talked about in a political context. So politicians talk about these things all the time. So or activists might talk about them. And, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But somehow just like telling people that they're doing philosophy, telling people that they're in the philosophy room now and they're going to talk with each other as philosophers, puts people on their best behavior. And in the right circumstances, not all the time, but in the right circumstances. And so this is one of the things that philosophy can do, is I think put people on their best behavior in their interactions with one another. And that can do something to, one node at a time, repair our epistemic relationships with people. It's easy to take that point too far. There are some people who are lost causes. You don't need to repair your epistemic relationships with Nazis, whatever. But you have nothing to learn from them. They're goners. But but that's not true for everybody. So.
Yeah, I think the only thing I add to that is, in addition to helping people talk to each other, it can also help improve people's own habits of mind, so that the thought, I disagree with what somebody just said, or this is my view, it's just the beginning. One needs to be in the habit of asking, why do I disagree? Why does that other person think differently than I do? Do I see reasons to hold up my view in light of the reasons that they hold their view? Whether this is done in a communicative context or just reasoning through problems on your own. So I think that one thing that that philosophers can do in public is both model good reasoning and then push people to think in a deeper way about the things that they believe.
Yeah. I'll just give one other plug. I think this is available on the internet. The philosopher Rebecca Scott, in her teaching, has come up with this incredible list of the moves that you can make in a philosophical conversation. And I think one of Scott, when you say that, I disagree is the beginning of the conversation and not the end of it, I think one of the reasons why people might think it's the end of it is because of an impoverished understanding of what the possible moves are in a conversation, how to talk with other people, what sorts of things you can do with a turn when in a conversation. So I would just, if you Google it, it should be available. Rebecca Scott is the name of the philosopher, and it's something like, if you Google Rebecca Scott moves philosophy, hopefully something relevant will turn up. It's just, it's something I've been thinking about a lot this week anyway. So it's, she's great.
Well, thank you both. And you can purchase Ask a Philosopher from Literati Bookstore. There's another link in the chat. And of course, if you're watching later on YouTube, there's a link in the description below. We could keep going. I really would like to, but I'll let you both get back to dinner and dogs and children and all the rest of things that make life wonderful. Scott Hershovitz, Olasov, thank you so much for joining At Home with Literati tonight. Thank you for answering some burning philosophical questions. We really appreciate it. And hope we can do it again in the actual bookstore sometime on the other side of this. But until then, take care and be well. And thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to all of our guests, oh, go ahead, Ian.
Oh, I was just going to say, if anybody wants to follow up with me, feel free to send me an email. It's my full name at gmail.com, Ian Olasov at gmail.com. Happy to talk with people about whatever.
Thanks so much. And to all of our guests, thank you for joining us and for your support. And we hope you continue to stay safe and be well as well. And we will see you at the next event. Take care, all.
Okay. Bye.